Alright, so we're back, of course, talking about some Final Fantasy VII Remake. So we've been talking about the fate of Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge on this channel for the last 2+ years at this point. Obviously, we have confirmation for Biggs on what's happening. We visibly see him alive at the end of the game. Now, with Jesse and Wedge, it's sort of ambiguous. For Jesse, we simply have a glove on the table next to Biggs, and the interpretation of this is subjective from person to person. For some people, it means that Jesse's alive. Maybe she left her glove there for Biggs. And for others, maybe a sign that Jesse's dead. Maybe they found her body, took her gloves and her bandana off to give to Biggs since her and Biggs were close, something like that. But we don't know, right? And for Wedge, we simply have him being pulled out the window or thrown out the window by the Whisperers. It cuts to black. You hear the glass break. It's presumed that he would fall to his death because we're like 64 floors up or whatever. But we don't actually see anything. And kind of a basic rule of cinema or basic rule of thumb with kind of anything with storytelling, if you don't see them die, they can always come back, or rather, they're alive. Well, it turns out we actually have somebody that used the free cam during this specific moment to actually see what happens to Wedge whenever he's thrown out the window, because the screen cuts to black, we don't get to see anything. Which is something we've kind of looked at before, at least one other time on the channel, where somebody took the free cam in like the Turk's office whenever they're talking. And we're just sort of looking around to try to find anything that was interesting, and there ended up being a magazine that had Shinra from Final Fantasy X-2 on the cover. Now, I believe this magazine is seen maybe elsewhere within Remake. I can't remember if it's in base game or if it's an episode or mission, but you do see it, I believe, at least in at least one or two other locations or some shit. But the point is, you weren't supposed to really see this magazine during this cutscene. You never really get a good angle at the magazine to even see what the hell's on it. Now, I want to be clear about something before we get into it. What we're going to look at, I don't know if we can consider it 100% canon. And why I say that is because what we're going to look at is technically kind of out of the bounds of the game, and something we're never really supposed to see as the player. Pretty much every single game you play is going to have like cut content or just objects and things that are outside the bounds of the game that really have no impact on the actual game that you are playing. A random quick example that I can give off the top of my head is with Silent Hill 4, my personal favorite Silent Hill game. When you're in the spiral staircase, if you take the free cam outside the bounds of the map, you can actually see a gigantic moth, which is called the Float Stinger, which is an enemy from Silent Hill 1, but it has nothing to do with Silent Hill 4, or mostly because Silent Hill 4 has no connections really to like Silent Hill 1 or 3, and the gigantic moth Float Stinger has to do with the lesson, the story for Silent Hill 1, etc., etc. But again, it has no bearing on anything when it comes to Silent Hill 4. We don't even know to this day why it's even there. So again, what we're going to look at, I don't know if we can 100% say that it's canon because it's something we're not supposed to see as the player, but if we're going to take it for what it is and what we see, at least with my interpretation of it, I don't think Wedge would die from the fall that he takes. Because even though we're like 64 floors up, it's not that far of a fall. So quick shout out to VG7 for doing this on Twitter, which I think they're doing a lot lately, taking the free cam into certain areas of the game and looking around for shit. So definitely give them a follow if you want to see more of that. So we have 4 different images that kind of give you different angles of this scene right here, but the main thing to take away from any image that you look at is that Wedge isn't actually falling 64 floors, despite us being on the 64th floor. At least earlier in the cutscene it shows that he's only fallen maybe a couple, like less than 10, maybe like 5, 6, 7 floors at max. I think this image is maybe the best in terms of perspective to show that he's not fallen a small amount. You can see that it's at least a couple of stories or something, man. But it's not an amount that would necessarily be fatal, especially in a Final Fantasy game. And this is something that we could potentially survive, just kind of depending how you would land. Like, if you land your stomach or back first and bounce your head off the concrete, yeah, you're probably going to die. But if you fall, like, the right way, you could survive this. People fall out of planes and survive and shit. But this isn't too far of a fall or too different from a fall that he did earlier in the game whenever they're trying to drop the Sector 7 plate, right? He falls pretty damn far to the ground in Sector 7 slums and obviously gets right back up. And something we haven't really ever talked about for some reason when we've discussed Wedge's fate is the possibility of him having a grappling gun, which he uses during the Sector 7 platefall segment. It's also a possibility. Like, just because he gets flung out the window doesn't mean he's going to fall to his death. He can obviously use the grapple gun if he has one. Now, you don't see the grapple gun on his character model in this cutscene, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have one. Cloud and Tifa and Barret get them, like, in Chapter 6, I believe it is, and they have them throughout pretty much the entire game. It's, I guess, in their pocket or something. I don't know. You know, it's Final Fantasy. It's a video game. So that, of course, is a possibility. We might get like a flashback or a cutscene later on when we run to the character Wedge, because I'm assuming that the dude is alive, where it shows him, like, you know, saving himself, bracing himself. Maybe this time the grapple gun does work. It catches. It doesn't break. He doesn't have to fall to his death or something like that. Who knows? What it kind of comes down to is whether or not what we're seeing matters. As in, Wedge is being thrown out the window right here. What we're seeing is not that far of a fall, but is this really what's supposed to happen? Like, is he meant to be falling to a roof that's not that far of a fall, or is he meant to be falling off the side of the building where he's going to fall all 64 floors and die? Because we're not shown that, right? It's not meant for the player to see, at least as of right now, if we're ever meant to see it at all. But what I'm seeing is Wedge falling out a window to a pretty highly detailed roof. Like, they designed the shit out of this outside of the Shinra building, almost like we're going to come back to it at some point with like a cutscene or some shit. Like, what part of the Shinra building is this, and why is it so detailed, man? Because again, this is outside of the elevator. It's not a moment or a part of the Shinra building that I can recall a scene off the top of my head. I don't know where he's meant to be falling right now. If it's so detailed, it almost seems like an asset they plan on using or going to use at some point. It's a super interesting conversation, my dudes. I definitely want to know what your thoughts are on this, because it's something that's out of bounds. It's outside of a cutscene. It's a part of the game that we're not meant to see. Like, I know I said that a lot in the video, but it's true, right? It's something we're not meant to see right now, if ever at all, as the player. So I don't know if it matters too much. Now, whenever VG07 shared on Twitter, they said they had some bad news with the screenshots, but I don't see why, because what I'm seeing is Wedge not fallen very far. I think that's good news, if anything. If, like, you follow the camera outside with Wedge, with the free cam or whatever, and you're seeing all the way down to the bottom of Midgar, he's got to fall 64 goddamn floors, yeah, that's some bad news. But the fact that there's a roof for him to land on, I think, is pretty good news, if anything. So the main takeaway from this video, if we just take the scene for what it is, they went out of their way to design this roof to the Shinra building that Wedge is supposed to be falling on, right? It's almost confirmation, I would think, that he would survive this, or could survive this, rather, because I thought for the longest time now he's been falling 64 floors, right? Like, I've thought he would be alive just because we don't see him actually die. I don't know how he would have survived it. I don't know why I didn't think of the grapple gun until, like, now, but that's a possibility. Even if he was falling 64 floors, he could have the grapple gun as well. But if we just take the scene for what it is, the assets being used during the segment, it just doesn't look like our boy's fallen that far. At least not a fatal fall in a goddamn Final Fantasy video game. But my dudes, I of course want to pass this off to you. What are your thoughts? Because this is potentially huge, just depending on how you want to interpret it. Whether you want to think that what we're seeing is canonical or not, right? Is it just they threw his character model outside the Shinra building and it didn't matter where he was landing? Or do you think that they designed that roof intentionally to maybe use it at a later time? Of course, I'll have a link to BG07's Twitter down in the description below. Definitely recommend following them. They're doing a lot of free cam shit currently on Twitter, so it's interesting to see just aspects of the game that you're not really meant to. But my dudes, that is going to be the video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys aren't anyone said did more Final Fantasy VII Remake content. Turn on notifications. Follow me on Twitter, @davidYT, and my Discord. Links to most networks are in the description and in the outro. Later, guys.
Just tell me that I made a difference.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame, we blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.